The preacher's finger was already raised when Verity Calloway lifted her chin and made herself sit still. "Let the congregation bear witness," Elder Josiah Cobb said, his voice climbing to fill the rafters of the Wolf Creek Chapel, "to the sin that has taken root among us." He did not look at her by name. He did not have to. Every head in every pew had already turned, and Verity felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes settle on her shoulders like stones. She kept her hands folded in her lap, the black wool of her morning dress gone soft and thin at the elbows from 2 years of wear. She had known this morning would come, ever since Mrs. Prout had seen her crossing the alley behind the gilded spur at first light with a bucket and a scrub brush. She had known, and she had come to church anyway, because a woman who ran from her own truth had nothing left to stand on. "A widow of this town," the preacher went on, "has been seen entering a den of drink and vice under cover of near darkness, not once but many mornings past counting. I ask you, what respectable purpose could call a Christian woman to such a place?" A murmur went through the room like wind through dry grass. Verity felt her face go hot, but she did not lower her eyes. Let them look. Let them see a woman who had nothing left to hide because she had never had anything to hide at all. "I name her a sinner in this house of the Lord," Cobb said, "and until she confesses and repents before this body, I strike her name from the church rolls." He let the silence stretch, savoring it. "Does anyone here speak for her?" No one moved. Verity had expected no one would. The women who had once brought her stew after Thomas died, who had sat with her through the burying and the long gray winter after, sat now with their gloved hands folded and their eyes fixed carefully on the hymnals in the pew racks. She could not blame them. Fear of the preacher's tongue was its own kind of debt, and everyone in Wolf Creek owed something to somebody. She thought, sitting there with her spine straight and her hands cold in her lap, of all the mornings she had risen before first light so no one would see her walking to the spur with her bucket and her brush. She had told herself it did not matter what the town believed, so long as she knew the truth of it. She had told herself a great many things these 2 years to get herself through them, that grief dulled with time, that a woman alone could still hold her head up, that Thomas's failings were not hers to carry into her grave alongside him. She had believed most of it on her better days. She did not entirely believe it now, with the whole congregation's eyes upon her and not one voice raised in her defense. She was gathering herself to rise, to walk out with what dignity she could carry, since no one would carry it for her, when a chair scraped hard against the floorboards at the back of the church. Ransom Teague stood. He was not a man who often came to services, and his sudden height among the seated congregation drew every eye away from Verity as surely as a shot fired into the ceiling. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had built his own fortune with his own 2 hands, and his gray Stetson sat in his lap, turned over like he'd meant to leave it there and forgot. Verity had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, mostly across a counter, mostly about feed prices. She had no earthly notion why he was standing now. "I'll speak for her," Ransom said. Cobb's mouth thinned. "This is not your pulpit to take, Mr. Teague." "No," Ransom agreed. "It's yours, but you've made an accusation in front of the whole town, and I mean to answer it before the whole town, same as you gave it." He came forward down the center aisle, unhurried, his boot heels loud on the wood. "Mrs. Calloway's been cleaning the gilded spur 3 mornings a week since October. I know because I own the note on that building, and I collect the rent from Ezra Prout myself on the 1st of every month." A ripple went through the pews. Mrs. Prout, 3 rows up, went very still. "She isn't cleaning for wages of sin," Ransom said. "She's cleaning because her late husband left a debt to that saloon he never told her about before he died, and rather than let it go to the sheriff and lose her house on Larkin Street, she offered to work it off with her own hands. Scrubbing floors before the doors open and decent folk are awake to see her shamed by it. I know the sum. I know the schedule she's kept. And I'll tell you plain, in 3 years of watching men in this town gamble away their family's bread and never once own up to it, I have never seen anyone pay a debt with more honor than that woman has paid hers." Verity's throat had closed entirely. She had told no one, not her sister, not the women who once brought her stew, no one, because Thomas was 2 years in his grave and she would not let his memory be dragged through town gossip on top of everything else he'd cost her. She had meant to bear the debt alone and quiet, the way she'd borne everything since the fever took him. She had not known a single soul had noticed, let alone understood. That is, Cobb faltered, some of the thunder gone out of his voice. That does not change that she frequented a place of. It changes everything, Ransom said, and now there was iron under the words. You stood up there and called a grieving, hard-working widow a sinner in front of God and everybody because she went somewhere unseemly to keep a roof over her own head, and not one soul in this room asked her why before you did it. That's not righteousness, Elder Cobb. That's cruelty wearing a Sunday collar. The silence that followed was different from the one before, not the silence of judgment but the silence of a town realizing, altogether, that it had aimed itself at the wrong target. Verity heard someone weeping softly 2 pews back. She thought it might be Mrs. Prout. Ransom turned then, and for the first time since he'd risen, he looked at her directly. Something in his face had gentled, though his jaw was still set hard from what he'd just said. Mrs. Calloway, he said, and his voice dropped low enough that it felt, for a moment, as though the church had emptied of everyone but the two of them. I've watched you 3 years running. I watched you nurse your husband through that last hard winter without once asking anybody for help you hadn't earned. I've watched you take in mending from women who wouldn't spare you a kind word at the mercantile. And I have watched you walk into that saloon at 5 in the morning with your back straight, paying off another man's shame like it was your own, and never once complain of it to a living soul. He turned his hat over in his hands, and for a moment he looked almost boyish, almost unsure, though nothing else about him suggested a man who was often unsure of anything. I don't have the right words for what I mean to ask you, not in front of half the county and a preacher who owes you an apology. But I'll ask it plain, because plain is all I know how to be. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The church, which had been a court of judgment not 5 minutes before, went utterly still. Verity felt the blood leave her face and then rush back into it. She was aware of every eye in the room fixed on her, but for the first time that morning the weight of it did not feel like stones. It felt like witnesses to something else entirely. Mr. Teague, she managed, you don't owe me rescuing. I never asked it of you. No, he said, you didn't. That's near the whole reason I'm asking. He took a step closer, close enough now that she could see the sun lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray threading early through his dark hair, a man who had worked outdoors and worked hard for every acre he owned. I'm not offering you a debt paid, Mrs. Calloway. I'm offering you a name nobody can strike off a church roll, and a house nobody can shame you for cleaning, and a man who's admired you a long while and was too much a coward to say so until a fool with a pulpit forced my hand. A faint, wry warmth came into his voice, enough to loosen something tight in her chest. Seems the least I can do is make good use of the courage he lent me. Verity looked past him, at the rows of faces, some ashamed, some weeping, some simply astonished, and then at Elder Cobb, who stood frozen at the pulpit with his condemning finger still half raised and nowhere left to point it. She thought of 2 years spent proving, quietly and alone, that she owed no one an explanation for her own survival. She thought of Thomas, and the debt he'd left her without a word of warning, and how she had carried it the way she had carried every hard thing since, without complaint, without help, because help had never once been offered. It was being offered now, freely, in front of God and the whole shamed town. I never asked to be rescued, she said again, softer now, and found that her voice did not shake. But I would be gladder than I know how to say to be chosen. Something eased in Ransom's face, relief and warmth breaking through the hard steadiness like sun through cloud. Then I'm choosing, he said, plainly and for good. He crossed the last few feet of the aisle and held out his hand, not to lift her up as a man rescuing a drowning woman, but the way one offers a hand to a partner one intends to walk beside. Verity rose and took it, and the church, her church, the one that had cast her out not 10 minutes before, came alive around them with a sound she had not expected. Not scandal, but a low swell of astonished, grateful weeping, of women rising from their pews, of Mrs. Prout pressing a handkerchief to her mouth and nodding as though something long overdue had finally been set right. Elder Cobb found his voice last of all. "Mr. Teague, this is not how such matters are conducted." "Then I reckon we're conducting them different starting today," Ransom said, not unkindly, though there was no giving it either. "You'll strike nothing from any roll on my account, Elder, and you'll offer this lady the apology you owe her before this congregation goes home to its Sunday dinners. The rest of it, the wedding, the house, the life, that's between her and me, and we'll see to it proper in our own time with our own vows." Cobb's mouth opened and closed once before he managed, stiffly, "Mrs. Calloway, I spoke in haste. I am sorry for the wrong done you." It was not everything. It would not undo 2 years of quiet loneliness, or the debt Thomas had left her to carry alone, or the mornings she'd scrubbed another man's floor before dawn so no one would see her shame. But it was enough, spoken here, in front of everyone who had watched her nearly go under and done nothing. Verity felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since Thomas's funeral finally loosen, one slow breath at a time. She had not expected, when she dressed that morning in her thinning black wool, that she would leave this church a different woman than the one who had entered it. She had come prepared only to endure. She had not imagined enduring might end, not in vindication alone, but in a hand held out to her in full view of everyone who had ever doubted her worth. Outside, afterward, the September light lay gold and warm across the churchyard, and half the congregation lingered near the steps, unwilling to simply walk away from what they'd witnessed. Ransom walked her down the path at a slow, unhurried pace, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm as though it had always belonged there. "I meant what I said in there," he told her quietly, "every word." "I know," Verity said. "I could hear it plain enough to believe it clean through." "Good." He glanced sideways at her, and there was a smile working at the corner of his mouth now, careful and a little shy, as though he were only now feeling the full size of what he'd done in front of the whole town. "Because I don't intend to spend the rest of my life saying things I don't mean, Mrs. Calloway. Not to you." She looked out at Wolf Creek, the dusty street, the mercantile, the saloon whose floors she would never need to scrub again, and found that for the first time in 2 long years, the town did not look like a place that had judged her and found her wanting. It looked instead like a place she was finally, truly seen. "Then I don't intend to let you," she said, and when he laughed low, surprised, entirely delighted, she found she was laughing too, right there on the church steps, in full view of everyone who had once called her a sinner and now could not stop smiling at the sight of her. She had walked into church that morning prepared to be cast out alone. She walked out of it instead with her hand held fast in the grip of a man who had chosen her before the world and would, she understood now with a certainty as deep as bedrock, choose her every ordinary morning after, for as long as they both should live.